The United States has come out blaming Iran for attacks on 2 oil tankers earlier today. And who believes this? Because I know I don't. So let's just give you some of the background here. This is from CNBC. But the takeaways are this. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Thursday blamed Iran for attacks earlier in the day on oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman near Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, a vital shipping route through which much of the world's oil passes. Quote, Iran is lashing out because the regime wants our successful maximum pressure campaign lifted, unquote, Pompeo said. No economic sanctions entitle the Islamic Republic to attack innocent civilians, disrupt global oil markets, and engage in nuclear blackmail, he continued to say. The White House said President Donald Trump was briefed on the matter and blamed Tehran of being behind a similar attack on May 12th on 4 tankers in the same area. Now, why would Iran go and attack oil tankers? Because we've put maximum pressure on them for sanctions, and so now they want to escalate into war? That doesn't make any sense. Now, let's go on to say what the Washington Post wrote about this. So we've got these 2 petrochemical tankers in the Gulf of Oman. They came under suspected attack early Thursday amid the tensions between the United States and Iran. Here's what we know. This is from the Washington Post. The attacks, which were high profile and apparently carried out in broad daylight, marked a serious escalation in a volatile region and one of the world's most important waterways. The timing of the attacks was extremely sensitive and appeared aimed at undermining Japan's efforts to encourage talks between the United States and Iran. U.S. military officials have assessed that the attacks were carried out by Iran or forces under its influence, a defense official said. One of 2 ships attacked Thursday off the coast of Oman. A Japanese-owned tanker was targeted just as Japan's Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, was wrapping up a high-stakes visit to Tehran to help cool hostilities in the region and potentially mediate U.S.-Iran talks. Well, of course. Yes, there's Japan. Shinzo Abe goes to Iran. He says, you know what, maybe we can just kind of cool this down. And, strangely, while he's there trying to have peace talks with Iran, all of a sudden one of their oil tankers gets attacked. In order to what? So that we could then point to Iran and say, see Japan, they're not friendly. They're not for peace. Look at what they do. Yeah. What would be exactly Iran's motivation in that? The attack appeared timed to undermine those efforts. Right, because Iran would time it to undermine those efforts. Yeah, come visit us. Come hang out. Let's talk peace. Hold on. Let's blow up some of your oil tankers while you're here. No. Okay. Who believes this? Nobody believes this. Iran certainly wouldn't time it for that. That would be somebody else. Like perhaps the United States would time it while Japan is in Tehran to say, see, Iran, they're not friendly. The attack appeared timed to undermine those efforts, which Abe called a major step forward towards securing peace and stability in this region, something we don't want. The United States government does not want stability and peace. We don't want to secure that. We want war, right? We want war. So, hey, Japan, let's blow up one of your tankers so that you want war too. A second vessel, owned by Norway's Frontline, was on fire and adrift in the Gulf of Oman near the Strait of Hormuz. This would get the Europeans angry. It was suspected of being hit by a torpedo, an official with Taiwan's state oil refiner CPC Corp, which chartered the vessel, told Reuters news agency. Now, I'm not saying that this Taiwanese official was wrong, but you have to understand that Taiwan is under a lot of pressure right now with mainland China, and they desperately want the United States to remain on Taiwan's side and to continue to defend Taiwan. So they would have an absolute invested interest in sticking with the narrative of whatever the U.S. says. Just keep that in mind. A U.S. defense official who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe an evolving U.S. response said military officials assessed that the attacks were carried out by Iran or forces under its influence. He said officials think the attacks were conducted by divers using limpet bombs, but did not say how that conclusion was reached. You know why they would say it was divers and why they would use divers if this was a staged attack? Because there's no photograph evidence of this. And that's going to be important when we go on and we talk about the Gulf of Tonkin incident that marched us into the Vietnam War and how these two incidents parallel. Because when you have photographic evidence, it's a lot easier to convince people of who did it if they actually did it. But if they didn't do it and you know they didn't do it and you're going to stage it, you better do it from underneath. And then you say, oh, well, we don't have any photos of it because they did it from underneath. The U.S. Central Command is sending additional troops and weaponry to the Middle East. a move that senior officials have said is necessary to confront increased threats from Iran. There are no increased threats from Iran. Iran is not trying to pick a fight with the United States. That's the last thing Iran wants. They do not want war with the United States. That is not what Iran wants. There is no benefit to Iran for this. Not one single benefit. The incidents Thursday followed similar attacks targeting oil tankers in the same area last month, assaults the U.S. officials also blamed on Iran. Iranian officials deny involvement. Quote, suspicious doesn't begin to describe what likely transpired this morning, unquote. That's what the Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif said Thursday on Twitter. Yeah, suspicious doesn't even begin to describe this. So the good news about all of this is that when this attack happened, I went to Twitter and the Gulf of Tonkin was trending. So people are opening their eyes to the fact that the United States narratives are often a bunch of bullshit. We are getting marched into war, and this is how they're doing it. And the way to march people into war is by staging an attack. In fact, one Twitter user shared this this quote, and I want to share it with you because it is just so poignant before we move on here to talk about how this parallels with the Gulf of Tonkin. But this is a quote from Nazi Hermann Göring, and he said during the Nuremberg trials, he says, quote, naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in every country. That is exactly what is going on here. Our government is now saying that we're under attack. The Iranians are attacking oil tankers. They're attacking, they've done this before. They're doing it again. We're under attack. And hey, listen up, American people. We need to go to war now. And if you don't want to go to war, and if you speak out against it, then you're a pacifist. And furthermore, you might even be called a spy or a traitor. You might even be tried under treason or the Espionage Act. And if you haven't seen that video of mine, please go and watch it. It was demonetized, but it's something, so I'm not saying it because I make money off of it. I don't. But you have to watch that video because it will just open your eyes and shock you as to what our government, how far our government is willing to go when people speak out against war. People have been convicted of treason and espionage for speaking out against war, not for actually doing anything, but for speaking. That's who we are. So let's talk about how this parallels the Gulf of Tonkin. So the Gulf of Tonkin incident happened in 1964. This was the incident that largely facilitated us going full-fledged into the Vietnam War. The story, the official story from the government was that on August 2nd in 1964, a couple of U.S. Navy vessels were attacked by the North Vietnamese. That was actually true. Those vessels were attacked by the North Vietnamese. It happened in broad daylight, and they actually have photographs of everything. They've got photographic evidence. They have physical evidence. There is no denying that the North Vietnamese 100% did attack those vessels. What they didn't disclose, well, first let's start with what the narrative was that got us into war. That happened. They have evidence. Then on August 4th, they claimed that there was another attack from North Vietnam on the U.S. vessels again. That is when Lyndon B. Johnson went to Congress and got the Gulf of Tonkin Act passed, which was to allow us to escalate into actual conflict with North Vietnam. Now, years later, and the Vietnam War was an extremely, extremely costly war. 55,000 dead U.S. soldiers. Just the horror that the Vietnam War had on the American people and on the Vietnamese people. Now, my family are Vietnamese refugees. It was severe. I don't think anybody denies that the Vietnam War was an absolute mistake. Years later, documents were declassified, and even an admiral spoke out against Admiral Stockdale, who was there at the event and who was then commanded to lead the charge after, when Lyndon B. Johnson said, okay, now we're escalating and you're going to lead it, Admiral Stockdale. And he was like, what? Okay. So he came out later and said the whole thing was a farce. He actually said This is actually what the admiral said that. And by the way, this admiral ended up becoming, he was a POW for 7 years. He was an admiral. This was a well-decorated person who has a lot of clout. And this is what he had to say about this. He said, I can't find it right here. I've got so many notes here that are highlighted, and let me just look right here. Okay, he says, quote, "There was absolutely no gunfire except our own. No PT boat wakes, not a candlelight, let alone a burning ship. None could have been there and not have been seen on such a black night." In his memoir, Stockdale also remarked on the situation, quote, "I had the best seat in the house from which to detect boats, if there were any. I didn't have to look through surface haze and spray like the destroyers did, and yet I could see the destroyers' every move vividly." He then went on to say, okay, so he basically said that it didn't even happen. Later on, the next morning on August 5th, 1964, President Johnson ordered bombing raids on North Vietnamese military targets, which he announced were retaliation for the alleged incident of August 4th. When Stockdale was awoken in the early morning and was told he was to lead these attacks, he responded, "Retaliation for what?" Later, while a prisoner of war, he was concerned that he would be forced to reveal this secret about the Vietnam War. Could you imagine being an admiral and the whole thing's a farce? You were there. You saw that nothing happened. You saw this. And now you're being told that you're going to march the nation into war. You end up a prisoner of this war that is a farce for 7 years. And then you're watching and hearing about all of these young men being massacred and shipped back home in body bags by the thousands. And you're sitting there thinking, what the hell is this? I mean, I don't know what kind of horror that guy ended up living with towards the end, but I mean that must be awful to live with that, knowing that, which is why he spoke out against it apparently. So this whole Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, what actually happened on the first attack? So the North Vietnamese did attack the ships. But what wasn't disclosed was that we actually provoked those attacks. The United States was actually in on attacks against the North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese knew this, and they were retaliating. When McNamara went to Congress and said, "Oh my gosh, we're under attack, and we need to go to war," basically, he said that it was unprovoked, that the North Vietnamese were just attacking us. And here we are, and they're attacking us. And that just wasn't the truth. We'd actually been attacking them and in on attacks since January of that year. So for several months before they finally retaliated against the United States. So it was all a farce. And that led us into the Vietnam War. So here we are with the same narrative. It's like the American people have amnesia, except thank God many of the Americans don't. And this Gulf of Tonkin was trending on Twitter. Now, not a lot of people. It was, a couple thousand people, but a couple thousand is better than one or two. So there are people who are waking up to this. There are people who are saying, we're not going to believe these bullshit narratives. You did it to us in Vietnam. You did it to us in Iraq. And now you're going to try to do this to us in Iran. And we're not going to buy it. So it's really, really important that we, the people here in America, remember that we don't get amnesia all of a sudden, that we don't turn and look at the people calling for peace like Tulsi Gabbard and Mike Gravel and all these various people who come out speaking and then look at them and say, oh, well, they're just crazy. They're just crazy people and, which is what they do. And that's exactly what this Nazi in the Nuremberg trials, I can't believe I have to quote a Nazi in order to wake up the American people. But that's exactly what he says, is that, you basically you smear the pacifists, you smear them and you turn them into people who are against you, like what they were doing with Tulsi Gabbard, saying that she was somehow in with Russians. They try to build these narratives when you're saying, look, I want peace. I don't want war. This isn't right. We shouldn't be doing these things. That's what they do. That's what they do. And they're doing it again. And we need to stay diligent. We need to keep our eyes wide open to this. This is the Gulf of Tonkin all over again. We cannot allow this to happen. The administration is coming out. They are sitting here saying that it is Iran. They are blaming it on Iran. Iran has absolutely no reason to have done this. This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And when it makes no sense, then it's probably not true. And they did it also to Assad in Syria. A lot of people, and again, this was another one of those things that they tried to get Tulsi on when they were sitting there saying, well, why can't you just admit that, he's our enemy, or he's a brutal dictator and all these things. Why can't you just admit that he's our enemy and that he's an adversary? And it was based on this narrative that he had gassed his own people so that we could potentially say that he crossed a red line and now we need to go and engage. And now reports have come out recently, these last couple of months, from the engineers, from the people who have studied all of this. Again, I've got a video on it. Go back and watch it. That proved that actually it doesn't, the actual ballistics and the engineering, and when they went and did all of the simulations, they couldn't attach it to Assad. They couldn't attack those chemical attacks to him. There was no motive for him to do it. He was winning the war. It didn't make any sense. The only reason for it, the only thing that made sense was that we wanted to engage in battle. And so we needed a reason to march the American people into agreement that we need to go to war. And that is to say, look at what they're doing. They're harming people. How could you stand by and not say that this guy's our enemy? How could you stand by and not say this guy is our adversary when look at what he does? Now you're the problem. You're the problem. That is what they do to us. And they're going to do it again when it comes to Iran. They gave up on Syria. They moved on. Venezuela's not really working out so well either. So now they're doing it with Iran. They're going to try their best, and we need to keep our eyes wide open.